My name is Raymond, and I have been a fisherman since I was 14 years old. But nothing in my life prepared me for what happened on the 8th day we spent lost at sea. I want to tell you everything exactly as it happened, without leaving anything out, because I believe some stories are meant to be told even when they sound impossible. By the 8th day, the sun had become our enemy. It rose each morning like a judgment, climbing over a horizon that never changed, never offered land, never offered hope. My boat, the Constance, was a small, steel-hulled vessel built for coastal fishing, never meant for what we had been through. The engine had died on the 3rd night after a storm tore through our electronics, and since then, we had been drifting wherever the current decided to take us. There were 4 men with me. Daniel, my first mate, 26 years old, strong as an ox but terrified of silence. Marcus, our engineer, a quiet man in his 50s, who kept trying to fix the motor even after he knew it was hopeless. Tommy, the youngest of us, only 22, who cried the first 2 nights but had gone eerily calm by the 6th, and old Pete, 63 years old, a man who had survived 2 shipwrecks before this one, and who kept saying, in a voice too calm for comfort, that the sea always takes something before it gives something back. By the 8th day, our food was gone completely. We had rationed what little we had, some crackers, a few cans of tuna, half a bag of rice we ate raw because we couldn't spare fuel for the small stove. But by that morning, there was nothing left except the memory of taste. Our water was worse. We had maybe 2 liters left between the 5 of us, and the heat during the day made our throats feel like sandpaper. I remember looking at my hands that morning and noticing how thin they had become, how my wedding ring, which used to fit snugly, now slid loosely around my finger. The ocean around us was strange in those days. Not stormy, not calm, just endless. A flat gray-blue plain stretching in every direction, broken only by the occasional white cap or the shadow of a cloud passing overhead. There were no birds. I want you to understand how strange that is for a fisherman. Birds always come, even far from shore, circling boats, waiting for scraps. But for 3 days straight, we saw nothing. No gulls, no terns, not even the dark shapes of frigate birds that usually haunt the horizon. It was as if something had cleared the sky above us, as if we had drifted into a place the rest of the world had quietly agreed to avoid. Tommy started talking about his mother on the 6th day. He would sit at the bow, staring at the water, describing her kitchen back in Louisiana, the smell of her gumbo, the sound of her voice calling him in for dinner when he was a boy. At first, we let him talk because it seemed harmless, even comforting, but by the 8th day, his stories had turned darker. He started saying that he could hear her voice in the wind, that she was calling him now, out here, in the middle of nowhere. Old Pete told him to stop it, that the sea does things to a man's mind when the body starts failing, and that we needed to keep our heads clear if we wanted any chance of surviving. Daniel and Marcus had started arguing more frequently, small disputes over nothing, who drank more water, who slept longer, who wasn't pulling his weight, bailing out the small amount of water that leaked through a crack near the stern. I understood their anger. It wasn't really about water or sleep. It was about the fear that none of us dared to say out loud, that we were going to die out here, slowly, one by one, and that nobody back home would ever know what happened to us. I kept the log that day, writing in a water-stained notebook I had brought along, and my hand trembled as I wrote the words. Day 8. No food, almost no water, no sign of rescue. God help us. That night, I remember the silence more than anything else. Usually, even on a dying boat, there are sounds. The creak of metal, the slap of waves against the hull, the wind moving through whatever rigging remains. But that night, everything went quiet in a way that felt unnatural, almost deliberate. Marcus noticed it too. He looked up from where he was lying near the engine compartment and said, "You feel that? It's like the ocean's holding its breath." Nobody laughed. Nobody dismissed it. We had all felt it, and none of us wanted to admit how much it frightened us. I took the first watch that night, as I always did, sitting near the wheel with a flashlight whose batteries were almost dead, casting a weak yellow glow across the deck. I remember praying, quietly, the way I hadn't prayed since I was a boy, in my grandmother's church in Mobile, Alabama. I asked God for a sign, for anything, for some proof that we hadn't been forgotten out here in the vast emptiness of the Atlantic. I didn't expect an answer. I certainly didn't expect what came instead. Around 2 in the morning, Tommy woke up screaming, not from a nightmare, but because something had struck the hull, hard enough to shake the entire boat. We all jolted awake, hearts pounding, eyes wide in the darkness, waiting to see if it would happen again. For a few seconds, there was nothing, just the gentle rocking of the boat and our own ragged breathing. Then it happened again. A deep, heavy thud against the steel hull, like something enormous had rammed into us from below. Marcus grabbed the flashlight from my hand and pointed it toward the water, but all we could see was black, endless black, giving nothing away. Whatever was down there, it was still with us, and it wasn't finished yet. The second impact was harder than the first, and this time the whole boat lurched sideways, sending old Pete crashing into the railing. For a moment, nobody spoke. We simply stood there, frozen, listening to our own breathing and the slow, deliberate slap of water against the hull. I remember thinking, absurdly, of every shark story I had ever heard as a boy, every legend fishermen tell each other in port bars about creatures large enough to sink a boat. But sharks don't hit steel hulls twice in exactly the same spot with that kind of force. Something else was happening, and every instinct in my body told me it wasn't natural. Daniel was the first to move, grabbing the boat hook we used for pulling in nets, holding it like a spear, even though we all knew it would do nothing against whatever was out there. Tommy had backed himself into the corner near the cabin, his eyes wide, muttering something under his breath that I couldn't quite make out. Marcus kept the flashlight steady, sweeping it across the water in slow arcs, but the beam barely penetrated more than a few feet into the blackness. The ocean at night has a way of swallowing light whole, of making you feel like you're staring into something with no bottom, no edges, no mercy. "Could be debris," Marcus said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Storm probably tore something loose somewhere. Could be floating logs, could be—" He stopped mid-sentence because another impact hit, this time near the bow, and all of us stumbled slightly from the force of it. Old Pete, still rubbing his shoulder from where he'd hit the railing, shook his head slowly. "Logs don't hit boats in rhythm like that," he said. "That's something moving with purpose." I want to be honest with you about what went through my mind in that moment, because I think it's important for you to understand the state we were in. 8 days without proper food, dangerously low on water, exhausted beyond anything I had ever experienced, our minds were not exactly reliable instruments. I have asked myself many times since then whether exhaustion and fear shaped what we perceived that night. But I also know what I saw with my own eyes once the sun came up, and no amount of exhaustion explains that away. We debated for almost 20 minutes about what to do. Tommy wanted us to just wait it out, to stay quiet, and still, until whatever it was lost interest and moved on. Daniel wanted to fight back somehow, though none of us had any real weapons beyond a rusted machete we used for cutting bait, and the boat hook Daniel still gripped tightly. Marcus suggested we try to see what was actually causing the impacts before deciding anything, and it was his voice, calm despite everything, that eventually convinced the rest of us. We had one net left, a heavy cargo net we sometimes used for pulling large catches aboard, and Marcus proposed we cast it near the point of impact, see if we could catch whatever was down there, at least get a look at it before deciding whether to fight or flee. I remember old Pete objecting immediately, saying that pulling something aboard that had the strength to rock a steel-hulled boat was asking for trouble we couldn't afford. But desperation makes strange logic seem reasonable, and in the end, we were 5 exhausted, terrified men who needed answers more than we needed safety. The impacts had stopped by the time we prepared the net, and for a few minutes, I actually believed whatever it was had moved on, that we had been spared from having to test Marcus's plan. But then Tommy pointed toward the water, just off the port side, where something pale had risen just beneath the surface, visible even in the weak moonlight breaking through the clouds. It wasn't moving like an animal swims. It was floating, motionless, like something already dead or dying, rising and falling gently with the swell of the waves. We approached slowly, all of us crowded at the railing, staring down at this pale shape suspended just beneath the black water. Daniel leaned over with the flashlight, and in that moment, I saw his face change entirely, the anger and readiness for a fight draining away, replaced by something closer to pure shock. "That's not a fish," he whispered. "That's not anything I've ever seen." I looked down myself, and my mind struggled to process what my eyes were reporting, because the shape beneath the water, though humanoid in some ways, was unlike anything that belonged in our world. The skin, if you could call it that, had a faint grayish tone with an almost pearlescent sheen, like something between human flesh and the inside of a seashell. The limbs were proportioned strangely, longer than they should be relative to the torso, ending in hands with too many joints, fingers that curved slightly at the tips. The head was tilted back, face turned toward the surface, and though the features were vaguely humanoid, they were wrong in ways I struggled to articulate even to myself. Large, closed eyes that seemed to take up too much of the face. No visible nose, only 2 small slits. A mouth that seemed sealed shut, without lips in the way we understand them. Nobody spoke for what felt like a full minute. Then old Pete broke the silence, his voice barely above a whisper. "Lord, have mercy," he said. "Lord, have mercy on us all." I remember looking at each of my crewmen's faces in that moment, the fear, the disbelief, the strange flicker of something almost like reverence, and I knew that whatever we decided to do next would change everything about the rest of this voyage, however long it lasted, however it ended. We spent nearly an hour arguing about whether to bring it aboard at all. Tommy was adamant that we should leave it in the water, that whatever it was, it clearly wasn't natural, and that bringing something unnatural onto our boat could only invite disaster. Daniel, surprisingly, argued the opposite. If it was dying or already dead, at least we could examine it, maybe understand what had been hitting our hull, maybe even find something useful, though I don't think any of us really believed there would be anything useful about a creature like this. Marcus stayed quiet for a long time, watching the pale shape drift gently in the water, before finally saying what none of us wanted to say aloud. That if this thing was alive, and if it woke up while still in the water beside our boat, we would have no way of knowing what it might do to us. In the end, it was my decision to make, as captain, and I chose to bring it aboard. I told myself it was because I needed answers, because 5 men dying slowly of thirst and hunger deserved to at least understand what had found them in the vastness of the ocean. But if I'm honest with you now, so much time later, I think some part of me recognized this as the sign I had prayed for the night before, however strange and terrifying that sign turned out to be. I have thought about that decision every day since, wondering if I would make the same choice again, and every time, despite everything that followed, I believe I would. We used the cargo net carefully, sliding it beneath the floating form and lifting slowly, all four of us straining against ropes we had rigged to the boom above the deck. The creature was heavier than its size suggested, dense in a way that didn't match its slender frame, and by the time we had it hovering just above the water, sweat was pouring down all our faces despite the cool night air. Daniel kept muttering prayers under his breath, something I had never heard him do before in the 2 years he had worked for me. Old Pete stayed silent, his jaw set tight, his eyes fixed on the pale shape swinging gently in the net above the black water. When we finally lowered it onto the deck, none of us moved for several seconds, staring at what lay before us in the weak beam of Marcus's flashlight. Up close, the details were even stranger than they had appeared from a distance. The skin had a texture almost like wet leather, cool to the touch when Tommy, driven by some mixture of fear and curiosity, reached out and touched its arm briefly before yanking his hand back as if burned. There was no visible wound anywhere on the body, nothing to explain how it had ended up floating unconscious in the middle of the Atlantic, hundreds of miles from any shore. We debated for a long time about what to do next. Marcus suggested we needed to restrain it somehow, in case it woke violently, and though it felt strange to be tying up something we didn't even understand, exhaustion and fear made the decision easier than it should have been. We used what rope we had left, securing its wrists and ankles to the metal railing near the stern, careful not to touch its skin more than necessary. Tommy kept saying we should throw it back, that whatever we had pulled from the water didn't belong with us, didn't belong in our world at all. But nobody listened to him, and eventually he stopped protesting and simply retreated to the far side of the deck, watching from a distance with wide, frightened eyes. The night stretched on in a way that felt endless. None of us slept, though we were more exhausted than we had ever been in our lives. We took turns watching the creature, flashlight beams flickering across its still form, waiting for some sign of movement, some indication of whether it was alive or dead. Old Pete talked quietly about stories he had heard over the years from other sailors. Stories of strange lights beneath the waves, of shapes that moved too fast to be fish, of entire crews who claimed to have seen things they refused to discuss once they reached shore. I had always dismissed such stories as the product of too much rum and too many lonely nights at sea. Sitting there that night, I wasn't so certain anymore. Around 4 a.m, Marcus noticed something that sent a chill through all of us. The creature's chest, which had remained perfectly still since we brought it aboard, had begun to rise and fall in a slow, deliberate rhythm. It was breathing. Whatever this thing was, it was alive, and the movement of its chest, slow and steady, felt almost peaceful in a way that unsettled me more than violent thrashing would have. Daniel backed away several steps, gripping the boat hook again, though we all knew by now that it would offer little protection if this creature decided to act with whatever strength had allowed it to strike our steel hull with such force. Tommy began praying aloud, quietly at first, then louder, reciting verses I recognized from childhood Sunday services, asking God to protect us from whatever evil had found its way onto our boat. I didn't stop him, though something in me resisted the idea that what lay before us was necessarily evil. There was something in its stillness, in the strange peace of its breathing, that felt different from what I imagined true malevolence would feel like. I couldn't explain this feeling to my crew that night, and I'm not sure I can fully explain it to you now, but it stayed with me through every hour of that long, terrifying vigil. By 5 a.m, exhaustion had finally overtaken fear for both Tommy and Daniel, and they had fallen into uneasy sleep near the cabin, though even in sleep their bodies remained tense, ready to jolt awake at the first sign of danger. Marcus and old Pete stayed awake with me, the three of us sitting in a loose semicircle around the restrained creature, watching the eastern sky slowly begin to lighten with the first hints of dawn. None of us spoke much during those final hours of darkness. We simply waited, watching the rise and fall of that strange chest, wondering what the coming light would reveal, and whether any of us were prepared for what we were about to face. The sky had just begun turning that pale gray color that comes before true sunrise when the creature's eyes opened. I was the one watching at that moment, and I will never forget the sensation of those eyelids sliding back to reveal something that looked less like an eye and more like a dark pool of still water, reflecting the weak morning light in a way that seemed almost impossible for something biological. I called out to wake the others immediately, my voice cracking from days without enough water, and within seconds, all 4 of my crewmen were on their feet, staring at the creature that had, until moments before, seemed as still and lifeless as a corpse. It didn't thrash or fight against its restraints the way I had feared it might. Instead, it moved slowly, almost gently, testing the ropes around its wrists with what seemed like curiosity rather than aggression. Its head turned toward each of us in turn, and I remember feeling an overwhelming sensation of being studied, evaluated, in a way that felt entirely different from being looked at by an animal. There was intelligence in that gaze, something calculating and aware, and it made the hair on my arms stand up despite the growing warmth of the morning sun. Tommy backed away immediately, nearly tripping over a coil of rope in his haste to put distance between himself and the creature. Daniel raised the boathook again, though his hands were shaking so badly the tip wavered unsteadily in the air. Old Pete stood his ground, though I could see his jaw clenched tight, his eyes narrowed with a mixture of fear and fierce determination. Marcus, ever the engineer, seemed almost fascinated despite his fear, leaning slightly closer, as if trying to understand the mechanics of what he was witnessing, rather than simply reacting emotionally to it. And then it spoke. I want you to understand how impossible this felt in the moment, how every rational part of my mind screamed that this simply could not be happening. The voice that came from that strange mouth was smooth, measured, carrying a cadence that felt almost musical, and the words were perfect English, without any trace of an accent I could place. "You have nothing to fear from me," it said, its voice calm despite the ropes binding its wrists and ankles. "I mean you no harm. I understand your fear, but I ask that you listen before you act." For several long seconds, none of us responded. I think we were all waiting for someone else to speak first, waiting for someone to confirm that we had actually heard what we thought we heard. Finally, it was old Pete who found his voice, though it came out rougher than usual, edged with suspicion. "What in God's name are you?" he asked, and I noticed how his hand trembled slightly as he gestured toward the creature bound before us. The creature's expression, if you could call the subtle shifts in its features an expression, seemed almost to soften at the question. "I am not from your world," it said simply, "though I have observed it, and creatures like myself have observed it, for far longer than your species has kept record of time. I do not come to harm you. I was traveling through these waters when something disrupted my passage, and I found myself unconscious, drifting, until you pulled me from the water." It paused, its dark eyes moving across each of our faces again. "You saved my existence, whether you intended to or not. I am grateful for that, even bound as I am." Daniel lowered the boathook slightly, though he didn't set it down entirely. "You're saying you're an alien," he said, his voice flat with disbelief, even as the evidence sat directly before him. "Like, from another planet?" The creature tilted its head slightly, a gesture that felt almost thoughtful. "The concept of another planet is accurate, though incomplete," it said. "I come from a place that exists beyond what your species currently understands, as time and space combined. But such distinctions matter less than what brought us together this morning, on this vessel, in this ocean." I remember stepping closer at that point, driven by a mixture of desperation and something I can only describe as a strange, unexpected calm that had settled over me despite the impossibility of the situation. "We're dying out here," I said, my voice raw with exhaustion. "No food, almost no water, no rescue in sight. If you are not here to harm us, can you help us? Do you know where we are? Can you help us find our way back?" The creature's gaze settled on me, and for a moment, something passed across its features that I can only describe as sympathy, an emotion I hadn't expected to recognize in something so utterly foreign. "I understand your suffering," it said quietly, "and I will do what I can to help you in time. But first, I ask that you release my bindings. I give you my word, whatever that may be worth to you now, that I intend no violence toward any of you. And once you have decided to trust me, even a little, there is much I believe you will want to ask me, much that I believe you deserve to know, given everything you have endured these past 8 days." Something in its voice, in the strange gentleness of its request, made the decision for me before I had even fully considered it. I nodded toward Daniel, who, after a long hesitation, began loosening the ropes around the creature's wrists. Once its bindings were removed, the creature moved slowly, almost respectfully, positioning itself against the boat's railing rather than approaching any of us directly, as if understanding that trust needed to be earned gradually rather than assumed. It introduced itself, though the name it gave sounded less like a word and more like a sound our mouths weren't quite built to reproduce, something between a hum and a whistle that none of us could properly repeat. After a moment, it suggested we simply call it whatever felt comfortable to us, and Tommy, still trembling but curious despite himself, suggested the name Wren, for reasons he couldn't quite explain even to himself. The creature accepted this without complaint, and from that point forward, that is what we called it. Wren explained, in that same calm and measured voice, that it came from what it described as an extremely distant point in Earth's future, so far ahead that the concept of dates and years, as we understood them, had lost much of their meaning. It described its species as travelers, observers, who moved not just across vast distances of space, but across vast distances of time itself, studying civilizations, watching histories unfold, sometimes across millennia, in ways that felt to them the way a single conversation might feel to us. Marcus, ever the practical one, asked how such a thing was even possible, and Wren's answer left all of us staring at each other in stunned silence. "Time," Wren said, "is not the straight line your species imagines it to be. It is closer to an ocean, vast and layered, with currents that move in directions your science has not yet discovered how to measure. My people learned, long ago, how to move within these currents, much the way you learned to move across the surface of your own oceans. We do not consider it magic, though I understand it may seem so to you. It is simply a different understanding of what your physicists refer to as space-time, developed over a span of your history so long that comparing it to your current scientific understanding would be like comparing your fishing boat to the vessels my people once used to first leave our world." Old Pete, still deeply suspicious despite everything, asked why, if Wren's people had been observing Earth for so long, humanity had never encountered them properly before, why there weren't clear records, clear proof, throughout our history. Wren's response came slowly, thoughtfully, as if choosing each word with great care. "You have encountered us," it said, "throughout your history, in ways your ancestors described as visions, as encounters with beings of light, as strange lights in your skies that your religious texts sometimes attribute to messengers, to angels, to phenomena beyond easy explanation. We do not typically reveal ourselves as directly as I am revealing myself to you now. This circumstance, being pulled unconscious from your ocean, injured and vulnerable, was not part of any plan. It was, in its own way, an accident. This admission seemed to unsettle Ren itself, if such a thing could be unsettled, and for the first time, I noticed something like hesitation in its otherwise measured speech. Daniel pressed the point immediately, asking what exactly had happened to bring Ren into our waters, injured and unconscious, in the first place. Ren was quiet for a long moment before answering. "There are others who move through the same currents I move through," it said carefully. "Not all of them share the same intentions as my own kind. I was pursuing something, tracking a disturbance in this region of your ocean and this point in your history, when I encountered resistance I had not anticipated. That resistance is what left me as you found me." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication, and I remember feeling a chill despite the growing heat of the morning sun. Tommy, who had been quiet for a long stretch, finally spoke up, his voice tight with fear. "Resistance from what?" he asked. "What else is out there?" Ren's dark eyes moved slowly across each of our faces before settling on the horizon behind us, as if searching for something none of us could see. "That is a longer conversation," it said, "and one I believe connects to questions I sense are already forming in your minds. Questions about meaning, about purpose, about the deeper structure of existence itself." I remember exchanging a glance with old Pete in that moment, both of us thinking the same thing without needing to say it aloud. Here we were, dying slowly in the middle of the ocean, and yet the conversation unfolding before us felt larger than our own survival, larger than any of us had ever imagined a single conversation could be. Marcus asked, somewhat nervously, whether Ren's presence here, whether this entire encounter, had been some kind of destiny, some deliberate design rather than pure accident. Ren considered this question longer than any before it. "I do not believe in accidents the way your species sometimes uses that word," it finally said. "Even what appears random, even what appears chaotic, exists within patterns far larger than any single moment can reveal. Whether you call this destiny or providence or the will of a creator your species has long worshipped, I cannot say with certainty which word best applies, but I can tell you this. Very little in the history of your world, or the history of the universe surrounding it, has ever truly been accidental." Something in the way Ren said the word creator caught my attention immediately, and I felt a question rising in my chest that I hadn't dared ask yet, one that had been building since the very moment this strange visitor had first opened its eyes. Before I could voice it, Tommy beat me to it, his voice trembling slightly, as he asked the question that would change the entire direction of our remaining days at sea. "Do you know about God?" he asked. "Do you know if he's real? Do you know about Jesus?" The silence that followed felt heavier than any silence we had experienced since the impacts first struck our hull 2 nights before. Ren turned its dark, still eyes toward Tommy, and for a long moment it simply looked at him, as if weighing not just how to answer, but whether answering at all would change something fundamental about the remainder of our journey together. "Yes," Ren finally said, and something in its voice had shifted, become quieter, more careful, almost reverent in a way that surprised all of us, given how calmly it had discussed time travel and interdimensional currents just moments before. "I know of God. My people have known of the Creator for longer than your species has existed in its current form. It is, in many ways, the central mystery that has guided our own long journey of understanding across the countless worlds and eras we have observed." Tommy's eyes filled with tears at this answer, though I couldn't tell if they came from relief, from fear, or from some combination of both feelings tangled together after 8 days of believing he might die out here, without ever getting answers to the questions that mattered most. "Then why?" Tommy asked, his voice breaking slightly. "Why does he let things like this happen? Why are we out here dying with no food, no water, nothing? Why does he let there be so much evil in the world, so much suffering? This was the question, I think, that every one of us had carried silently in our hearts throughout this entire ordeal. The question that sits at the center of every person's faith when tested by real suffering. Ren was quiet for a long moment, its strange eyes seeming to look somewhere far beyond our small boat, beyond even the endless ocean surrounding us. "I cannot answer that question the way you might want me to answer it," Ren finally said. "I am not the creator, and I do not claim to fully understand the mind of the one who made all things, including my own kind, including this ocean, including the currents of time I have learned to navigate. But I can tell you what I have observed across the vast span of your history and the histories of countless other places I have witnessed. Suffering exists within a larger design that your species, and honestly my own species as well, only glimpses in fragments. What feels senseless to you in this moment may connect to purposes far beyond what either of us can perceive from where we stand." Old Pete, ever practical despite his fear, pressed further. "Are you saying suffering has a purpose? That God wants us to suffer?" Ren shook its head slowly, a gesture that felt surprisingly human, despite everything else about its appearance. "No," it said firmly. "I do not believe the Creator desires suffering for its own sake. What I have observed, across the long history of your world and others, is that suffering often exists as a consequence of forces set into motion long ago. Forces involving choice, involving freedom, involving a kind of moral structure to the universe that your species has always sensed intuitively, even before you had words to describe it fully." Marcus, listening intently, asked whether this meant that everything happening to humanity, all our wars, our suffering, our struggles, was simply the result of choices made by humans themselves, without any larger spiritual dimension involved. Ren considered this carefully before responding. "Not entirely," it said. "There are dimensions to this that extend beyond simple human choice. There are forces, some that predate humanity's own history, that have long influenced the trajectory of your species, sometimes toward destruction, sometimes toward transcendence. But even these forces, as ancient and powerful as they may seem, remain subject to something greater, something your religious texts have long described as sovereign authority, an authority that ultimately governs even what appears chaotic or malevolent." I found myself speaking then, my voice hoarse from days of thirst, but driven by something urgent inside me that needed to understand more fully what this creature was describing. "Are you saying there are evil forces at work in the world, beyond just human evil?" Ren's gaze turned to me, steady and unblinking. "Yes," it said simply. "There are forces that exist beyond what your species can easily perceive or measure. Forces that have long influenced human history in ways both subtle and dramatic. Your ancient religious traditions, particularly those preserved within Christian scripture, have described these forces with remarkable accuracy, though your species has often struggled to fully grasp the scope of what these descriptions actually represent." The weight of this conversation settled over our small boat like a physical presence, heavier somehow than the exhaustion, the hunger, the thirst that had defined every hour of the past 8 days. Daniel, who had remained mostly silent throughout this exchange, finally spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "If there's evil out there influencing things, working against us, why would God let it? If he's really in control, why not just stop it?" Ren turned toward Daniel with what seemed like genuine consideration, taking time before responding to a question that carried the weight of centuries of human theological struggle behind it. "I believe," Ren said slowly, that the answer lies in something your scripture calls free will, combined with a patience that exceeds anything your species, or honestly my own species, can fully comprehend. The Creator, as I understand from everything I have observed across countless ages, allows both good and evil to exist within a framework that ultimately serves a purpose beyond immediate understanding. This does not mean evil goes unchecked forever, or that suffering exists without eventual resolution. It means that within the timeline of existence as your species experiences it, certain things must play out according to a design far larger than any single moment of suffering, however painful that moment may feel to those living through it. Something about hearing these words, spoken by something so utterly foreign to our world, brought unexpected tears to my own eyes, tears I hadn't expected after everything else we had endured. It was Marcus who asked the question next, and I remember being surprised because Marcus had never struck me as a particularly religious man during the 2 years we had worked together. "What about Jesus?" he asked, his voice quieter than usual. "You said your people have known about God for a long time. Do you know about Jesus Christ? Do you know if what the Bible says about him is true?" Ren's response to this question came slower than any answer before it, as if the creature understood the weight this particular topic carried for each of us, understood that whatever it said next mattered more than anything else in this entire strange encounter. "Jesus Christ," Ren said, and there was something in the way it pronounced the name, something almost like reverence, that caught all of our attention immediately. Of all the events I have witnessed across the long span of your world's history, and the histories of other worlds I have observed, nothing compares to what occurred during that brief period of your history, roughly 2,000 years ago by your current calendar. I will not claim to fully understand the totality of what happened during that time, but I can tell you this. It represents, from everything my people have observed across countless ages, the single most significant event in the entire history of your world, and perhaps in the history of existence itself." Tommy leaned forward, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten, his eyes wide with a hunger for understanding that went far beyond his physical hunger for food. "So it's true?" he asked. "He really was who the Bible says he was, the Son of God." Ren was quiet for a long moment, its dark eyes reflecting the growing light of the morning sun, now fully risen above the horizon. "I will tell you what I have observed," it said carefully, "though I recognize that faith, true faith, is not something that can simply be handed to you through observation or evidence. It must be chosen, embraced, lived. But I can tell you that the events surrounding that period of your history carry a weight, a significance that transcends ordinary historical events in ways I have not observed anywhere else across all the ages I have witnessed." Old Pete, who had grown noticeably quieter and more thoughtful as this conversation progressed, asked whether Ren's people believed in Jesus themselves, whether creatures from beyond our world shared the same faith that had shaped so much of human history and culture. Ren considered this question carefully. "My people do not worship in the way your species worships," it said. "But we recognize truth when we observe it. And across the vast span of history I have witnessed, certain truths remain constant, unshaken by the passage of time or the changing of civilizations. The truth of sacrifice, of redemption, of a path toward reconciliation between imperfect beings and a perfect Creator. This truth appears again and again, in different forms, across different worlds, but nowhere as clearly, as completely, as in what your scriptures describe regarding Jesus Christ." I found myself asking the question that had been building in my chest since childhood, since long before this voyage, since long before I had ever imagined I would one day ask it to a creature not of this world. "Is he coming back?" I asked. "Like the Bible says? Will Jesus really return? Ren turned its full attention to me, and something in its gaze felt different in that moment, more direct, more certain than it had been throughout the rest of our conversation. Time, as I have already explained, exists differently than your species currently understands it, Ren said. From where I stand, having moved through currents of time your species has not yet discovered, I can tell you that certain events remain fixed, certain outcomes remain certain, regardless of how the currents around them shift and change. What your scriptures describe as the return of Christ is, from everything I have observed, one such fixed and certain event. The weight of this statement settled over the boat in complete silence. Daniel, who had remained skeptical throughout much of this exchange, finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. How can you be so sure? How can something so far in our future already be certain from where you're standing? Ren's answer came slowly, thoughtfully, as if trying to translate a concept that existed beyond the boundaries of human language entirely. Imagine, it said, that time is not a river flowing in one direction, but an ocean, vast and layered, where certain points exist as fixed islands, regardless of which currents move around them. I have traveled far enough within this ocean to witness certain of these islands directly. What your scripture describes as Christ's return is one such island, fixed and unmoving, regardless of how much time, as your species experiences it, still remains before that moment arrives. Marcus, ever analytical, pressed further, asking whether this meant that everything described in Scripture, all the prophecies, all the promises, existed as fixed points that Ren's people had somehow directly observed. Ren was careful in its response. Not all of it, it said. Much of what exists in your scriptures involves deep spiritual truths that transcend simple observation. Truths about the nature of God, about the relationship between Creator and creation, about redemption and grace that exist beyond what even my people, with all our understanding of time and space, can fully claim to observe directly. But certain events, certain fixed points within the greater structure of history, we have witnessed, and what your scripture describes regarding the ultimate return of Christ and the ultimate resolution of the struggle between good and evil in your world. This, I can tell you with confidence, remains true. As the morning sun climbed higher above the horizon, casting long golden light across the calm water surrounding our small boat, I remember feeling something shift inside me, something I hadn't expected to feel, given the desperate circumstances we still remained trapped within, despite the hunger gnawing at my stomach, despite the thirst burning in my throat, despite the very real possibility that we might still die out here, regardless of everything we had just learned. I felt something like peace settling over me, a peace I hadn't experienced since long before this voyage began. I looked around at my crew and saw similar expressions on their exhausted faces, not relief from our physical suffering, which remained unchanged, but something deeper, something that made even the possibility of death feel less terrifying than it had just hours before. As the morning wore on, the conversation shifted toward darker territory that none of us had expected to explore when we first pulled Ren from the water 2 nights before. It was old Pete who guided the conversation there, his voice heavy with decades of experience, witnessing humanity's capacity for cruelty during his long years at sea, encountering sailors and dock workers and merchants from every corner of the world, seeing firsthand the corruption and violence that seemed to follow human civilization wherever it spread. You mentioned evil forces earlier, he said, looking directly at Ren. Forces beyond just human choice. What exactly did you mean by that? Ren was quiet for a long moment, as if choosing how much to reveal, how carefully to frame what it clearly recognized as difficult and potentially disturbing information. Throughout your history, it finally said. There have been influences at work that extend beyond simple human nature. Forces that predate your species' current form, that have long sought to understand, and in some cases manipulate, the trajectory of human civilization. Some of these influences align with what your scriptures describe as spiritual evil, forces working in opposition to the Creator's ultimate design. Others involve ancient civilizations, some from your own world's distant past, others from beyond it, who have conducted what might be described as long-term studies of human behavior, human psychology, human capacity for both good and destruction. Daniel's face had grown pale as he listened to this explanation. "You're saying we're being studied? Like experiments?" he asked, his voice tight with a mixture of fear and anger. Ren nodded slowly. "In some instances, yes," it said. "Your species has long wondered why certain patterns of violence, certain cycles of war and corruption, seem to repeat themselves across different civilizations, different eras, almost as if guided by unseen hands. Some of this repetition stems simply from human nature itself, from the fallen condition your scriptures describe extensively. But some of it, I must tell you honestly, has been influenced, shaped, sometimes deliberately provoked, by forces both spiritual and, in certain rare instances, by other civilizations who arrived long before my own kind began observing your world." Marcus, always seeking to understand mechanisms and systems, asked why any civilization, human or otherwise, would want to study human suffering, human violence in such a manner. Ren's answer was somber. "Understanding," it said, "particularly understanding of consciousness, of moral choice, of the capacity for both great love and great cruelty within a single species, has long been considered valuable knowledge across many civilizations throughout the universe. Your species possesses a unique combination of intelligence, emotion, and free will that makes you, whether you realize it or not, a subject of considerable interest to civilizations far older and more advanced than your own. Not all of this interest has been benevolent." Tommy, visibly shaken by this revelation, asked the question that I think all of us were desperately hoping Ren would answer reassuringly. "But God's still in control, right? Even with all this stuff happening, all these forces working against us, He's still bigger than all of it." Ren's response came immediately, without hesitation, carrying a certainty that steadied all of our racing hearts. "Yes," it said firmly, "nothing I have described to you, none of these forces, none of these ancient influences, none of this darkness that has shaped so much of your history, exists outside the sovereignty of the Creator. Everything, without exception, remains within a plan that was established before any of these forces began their influence. A plan that your scriptures have long described as already known, already accounted for, already destined for ultimate resolution." I remember feeling a strange mixture of relief and continued unease at this answer, and I asked Ren directly whether this meant that all the suffering we had witnessed throughout our own lives, all the corruption we had seen in the world, all the violence that seemed to plague humanity endlessly, served some ultimate purpose within this larger divine plan. Ren considered this carefully before responding. "I believe," it said, "that suffering, even suffering caused by malevolent forces, even suffering that appears senseless from within the limited perspective of a single human lifetime, ultimately serves to reveal deeper truths about the nature of good and evil, about the necessity of choice, about the value of redemption. This does not diminish the real pain such suffering causes, but it does mean that nothing, however dark, however seemingly chaotic, exists beyond the ultimate authority and purpose of the one who created all things, including time itself." Old Pete, who had remained largely silent during this exchange, finally spoke again, his voice thoughtful. "So what do we do with that? Knowing there's darkness out there, working against us, But knowing it's not stronger than God? How does a person live with that kind of knowledge? Ren turned toward old Pete with what seemed like genuine respect for the depth of his question. You live, it said, the same way your scriptures have long instructed your species to live, with faith, with hope, with love toward one another, resisting the darkness not through fear, but through conviction that the ultimate outcome has already been determined, and that outcome favors goodness, favors redemption, favors the ultimate triumph of light over the shadows that have long sought to obscure it. As the sun climbed higher, casting bright light across the vast, empty ocean surrounding us, I found myself reflecting on my own life, on choices I had made, on moments of weakness and moments of strength, wondering how my own story fit into this larger cosmic narrative Ren had described. I thought about my wife, waiting back home, likely fearing the worst by now, given how long we had been missing. I thought about my daughter, only 7 years old, who I had promised to teach how to fish properly once she turned 8. And I thought, with a clarity I hadn't expected given our desperate circumstances, that whatever happened to us out here, whether we survived or whether this became our final resting place, something profound had already changed within me, something that no amount of hunger or thirst or fear could take away. The peace that had settled over our small crew during those hours of conversation with Ren was shattered abruptly on the afternoon of what would become our 9th day adrift. The sky, which had remained clear and unnervingly still throughout the morning, began darkening rapidly around 2 in the afternoon, clouds building on the horizon with a speed that felt almost unnatural, even to men who had spent their entire lives reading the moods of the ocean and sky. Marcus, glancing nervously toward the darkening horizon, muttered that he had never seen weather build that fast, not in 30 years of fishing these waters. Ren, still seated near the railing where we had left it after removing its restraints, turned its attention toward the approaching storm with an expression that seemed to combine concern with something closer to recognition, as if it understood something about this weather that the rest of us didn't. This is not a natural storm, it said quietly, and the certainty in its voice sent a fresh wave of fear through all of us, fear that had only just begun to ease during our long morning of conversation. The forces I mentioned earlier, the ones working against the natural order, against what I sensed pursuing me before I found myself in your waters. I believe they have located this vessel. Tommy's face went pale immediately. What does that mean? He asked, his voice trembling. What's going to happen? Ren rose slowly from where it had been sitting, moving toward the center of the deck, with a fluid grace that seemed at odds with its earlier stillness. I cannot say precisely, it admitted, but I believe we should prepare for conditions far more severe than what your instruments would predict from natural weather patterns alone. Whatever pursued me before injuring me is likely attempting to prevent the conversation we have shared this morning from continuing, or perhaps attempting to prevent whatever comes next in this story from unfolding as it should. The storm hit us within the hour, and it was unlike anything I had experienced in over 20 years of fishing these waters. The waves grew from gentle swells to towering walls of dark water within what felt like minutes, and the wind howled with an intensity that seemed to carry something beyond simple meteorological force, something that felt almost deliberate, almost hostile in a way that transcended normal weather. Rain lashed against us horizontally, stinging our exposed skin, while lightning split the sky in jagged patterns that illuminated the churning ocean around us in brief, terrifying flashes. Daniel struggled at the wheel, fighting to keep our bow pointed into the waves, while Marcus and old Pete worked desperately to secure whatever loose equipment remained on deck, equipment that threatened to become deadly projectiles in the violent pitching of our small boat. Tommy huddled near the cabin, praying loudly now, his voice nearly lost beneath the roar of wind and water, calling out to God with a desperation that came from somewhere deep and primal within him. Through it all, Ren remained remarkably calm, moving across the pitching deck with an ease that defied the chaos surrounding us, offering guidance in a voice that somehow carried clearly through the howling storm. "Turn 30 degrees to port," Ren called out to Daniel at one point, and though it made no immediate sense given our current heading, something in the creature's tone convinced Daniel to trust the instruction without question. Moments later, a massive wave that would have struck us broadside instead glanced off our stern, and though the impact still nearly capsized us, I believe Ren's guidance saved us from what would have been a fatal collision. Throughout the worst of the storm, Ren continued offering similar guidance, small corrections and warnings that seemed to anticipate the ocean's violent movements moments before they occurred, as if the creature could perceive patterns within the chaos that remained invisible to the rest of us. At the height of the storm, during a particularly violent surge that sent all of us scrambling for handholds to avoid being swept overboard, I found myself praying more fervently than I had ever prayed in my entire life. I prayed not just for our survival, but for understanding, for the strength to face whatever came next, whether that meant rescue or whether it meant this storm would finally claim what 8 days of hunger and thirst had failed to claim. I remember looking toward Ren during this moment of desperate prayer and seeing, for just a brief second, an expression on its strange features that looked remarkably like solidarity, like shared prayer, though I couldn't be certain whether creatures like Ren prayed in any way comparable to how humans understand prayer. The storm raged for nearly 3 hours, testing every ounce of strength and skill remaining in our exhausted, starving bodies. There were moments when I genuinely believed we would not survive. Moments when waves towered so high above our small boat that I could see nothing but dark water on all sides. Moments when the wind screamed with such fury that I couldn't hear my own crew shouting instructions just feet away from me. But through it all, we held together, guided by Ren's strange, precise instructions and by a determination that felt strengthened rather than weakened by everything we had learned during our conversation that morning. Just as suddenly as it had begun, the storm began to break, the towering waves gradually softening into more manageable swells, the screaming wind fading into a steady, exhausted breeze. As the clouds finally began parting, revealing patches of blue sky and the warm glow of late afternoon sunlight, all 5 of us collapsed onto the deck, utterly spent, staring upward in stunned disbelief that we had actually survived what had felt, for those 3 terrible hours, like certain death. Ren remained standing among us, its dark eyes scanning the horizon with an expression that seemed to combine relief with continued vigilance, as if understanding that whatever had sent that storm might not yet be finished with us entirely. We lay on that battered deck for nearly 20 minutes after the storm passed, none of us having the strength to move, all of us simply grateful to be alive after everything we had endured. It was old Pete who first noticed something on the horizon, sitting up slowly and pointing toward a small, dark shape, barely visible against the brightening sky. "Is that," he began, his voice hoarse and uncertain, unwilling to hope too fully after everything we had been through. We all turned to look, and there, unmistakably, was the silhouette of a large vessel, moving steadily across the horizon, close enough that we might actually be seen if we could signal properly. Marcus scrambled toward what remained of our emergency flares, praying they hadn't been damaged during the storm's violence, while Daniel and Tommy began waving whatever fabric they could find, desperately trying to catch the attention of whoever might be watching from that distant ship. I remember the flare finally igniting, shooting bright red light into the darkening evening sky, and the collective breath we all held as we waited to see whether the distant vessel would notice and respond to our desperate signal. It felt like an eternity, though it was probably only minutes, before we saw the distant ship begin altering its course, turning gradually toward our position. Tommy began sobbing with relief, and even old Pete, hardened by decades at sea, wiped tears from his weathered face as the realization settled over us that we had actually survived. That rescue was finally, truly, coming after 9 impossible days adrift. I turned to share this moment with Ren, wanting the creature who had guided us through both physical and spiritual storms to witness this moment of salvation alongside us. But Ren was watching me with an expression I hadn't seen before, something that combined warmth with what felt unmistakably like farewell. "Your rescue is close now," it said quietly, its voice carrying beneath the growing sounds of our approaching salvation. "I must leave before that vessel arrives. My presence here, in your world, in this moment of your history, was never meant to be witnessed by others beyond this crew." I felt a surge of protest rising in my chest, wanting to ask Ren to stay, wanting answers to 1,000 more questions that had formed during our long, strange night and day together. But something in its calm certainty told me this moment had already been decided, long before we had ever pulled it from these dark waters. "Before I go," Ren said, moving closer to where I stood, "I want to leave you with something I believe you will need in the days and years ahead, something beyond the answers we have already discussed." It paused, its dark eyes holding mine with an intensity that felt almost overwhelming. "What you experienced these past 9 days, the suffering, the fear, the desperation, and now this moment of unexpected salvation, this mirrors something far larger, something your own faith has already taught you, though perhaps you have never felt it as directly as you have felt it now. The Creator does not abandon those who call out in genuine need, even when the waiting feels unbearable, even when the darkness seems endless. Salvation comes, sometimes in the most unexpected forms, exactly when it is needed. Never before, never after." I felt tears forming in my own eyes as Ren spoke these final words, understanding somehow that this strange, impossible encounter had been about far more than simple survival, that it had reshaped something fundamental within my own faith, my own understanding of God's presence, even during the darkest, most desperate moments of human suffering. "Will we ever see you again?" I asked, my voice thick with emotion I hadn't expected to feel towards something so utterly foreign just 2 days before. Ren's expression softened into something that almost resembled a smile, though its features weren't quite built for such human expressions. "Time," it said gently, "moves in ways your species is only beginning to understand. Perhaps our paths will cross again, in ways neither of us can currently anticipate. But know this, what you learned during these days together, the truths about faith, about suffering, about the ultimate sovereignty of the Creator over even the darkest forces that seek to disrupt His plan, these truths remain constant, regardless of whether we meet again. Carry them forward. Share them with others who need to hear them, as I believe you now understand them more deeply than you did before finding me in your waters." As the rescue vessel drew closer, its searchlights beginning to sweep across the darkening water toward our small, battered boat, Ren moved toward the railing where we had first pulled it from the ocean 2 nights before. Without another word, without any dramatic display, it simply slipped over the side and disappeared beneath the dark water, leaving barely a ripple to mark its passage. We rushed to the railing, searching the water desperately for any sign of where it had gone, but there was nothing, only the endless dark ocean, calm now after the fury of the storm, giving no indication that anything unusual had ever occurred within its depths. The rescue ship reached us within the hour, and I will spare you the details of that reunion. The medical attention, the debriefing, the disbelief we encountered when attempting to explain what had actually happened during our 9 days adrift. Most people who heard our story assumed dehydration, and starvation had caused us to hallucinate. And honestly, some days, even I wonder if that explanation might be simpler to accept than the truth we all experienced together. But I know what I saw, what I heard, what I felt during those long hours of conversation with a creature that called itself Wren, somewhere in the vast, dark waters of the Atlantic. And I know that whatever it was, wherever it came from, it left me with a faith stronger and deeper than any I had known before, a certainty that regardless of the darkness that sometimes seems to overwhelm this world, we are never truly alone, never truly abandoned, and that whatever storms we face, salvation always arrives exactly when it is needed most. I have never told this story publicly until now, but I felt, after everything that happened, that some stories are simply too important to keep silent forever.